what if the deal that was supposed to stop a trade war was never real? To begin with, China just closed the tap on the minerals that power your phone, your car, your defense systems. Now the US is accusing China of totally violating a deal signed just weeks ago, even though it was Washington that fired the first shot, sanctioning China's tech giants days after the handshake. Imports have collapsed. Rare earth prices are up 21%. And President Trump says the next move is inevitable. But what if China's next move is no move at all? Because this time, silence may be the deadliest strategy in the war. On May 30th, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CBS that China was withholding products essential to India, Europe, and our supply chains, accusing Beijing of breaching a 90-day trade truce inked in Geneva just weeks prior. But according to Reuters, just 3 days after that same deal, the U.S. sanctioned 5 more Chinese semiconductor firms, sparking immediate diplomatic protest. President Trump then declared on Truth Social that China has totally violated its agreement, yet made no mention of America's post-deal enforcement blitz. Bloomberg reports that rare earth shipments from China were already slowing prior to Bessant's appearance, with export licenses delayed by internal review, not official bans. The contradiction: Washington claims sabotage while Beijing cites a procedural backlog. But this isn't a new script. It's a rerun with new actors. The real question is whether the violation is one of terms or of trust. And that distinction may decide what collapses next. If the trade deal was a ceasefire, why are tariffs still flying? Geneva was supposed to pause hostilities with both sides, agreeing to suspend tariffs exceeding 100% for 90 days. But by May 25th, the U.S. Commerce Department had announced additional restrictions on AI chip exports to China, citing national security risks. A move, the Wall Street Journal noted, undermined the very spirit of the Geneva framework. China responded not with press conferences, but with silence. No mineral release, no clarification, no escalation. Bessent told Fox News, "Maybe it's a glitch. Maybe it's intentional. But if ambiguity is policy, then China may be using silence as leverage, while America uses sanctions as punctuation." According to IHS, market bilateral trade volume fell 18.6% year over year in May, the steepest contraction since the 2019 tariff war. The White House says China blinked. Beijing says it's still blinking. But someone's finger is still on the trigger. Signed on May 12th, the Geneva Agreement lasted about as long as a dry erase marker in a hurricane. The deal paused tariff hikes until mid-August, but included no enforcement mechanisms, no arbitration clauses, and no agreed list of deliverables, only vague promises on rare earth access and reduced trade friction. Analysts at the Peterson Institute called it a political optics deal, not a structural accord. So when Bessent now complains of non-compliance, the agreement's loopholes are hard to ignore. And the timing raises eyebrows. U.S. sanctions resumed after the truce, not before. Was Geneva just a diplomatic PR stunt to cool markets with no intent to follow through? Or worse, was it designed to fail? That ambiguity may be more destabilizing than open hostility. So what do you call a ceasefire where only one side disarms? On May 12th, they called it peace. By May 15th, they called in lawyers. And by May 25th, Washington was firing off chip sanctions like the deal never existed. This wasn't a truce. It was a photo op with a countdown timer. Trump stood behind a podium, hailed Geneva as a breakthrough. Then his administration sanctioned China's semiconductor backbone midway through the applause. And when China didn't react, they were accused of violating the agreement. That's like lighting a fuse, tossing the match, then blaming the fire marshal for the explosion. Meanwhile, Beijing hasn't even flinched. No fiery speeches, no embargoes, just nothing. A black hole of diplomacy. But here's the twist. That silence is doing more damage than words ever could. Rare earth exports quietly delayed. Shipment licenses buried in red tape. Neodymium spot prices up 21% in 2 weeks. And while U.S. officials scream, foul, Xi's poker face is turning into policy, as Bonnie Glaser of the German Marshall Fund warned. Once silence becomes a weapon, the old playbook stops working. So now D.C. is shouting into a void. And that void is full of empty shelves, stalled ports, and supply chains running on fumes. Welcome to diplomacy by disappearing act. Because the deadliest strategy in this war might be doing absolutely nothing at all. April imports from China dropped 19.8%, according to Advanced Commerce Department data, slashing the U.S. goods trade deficit nearly in half compared to March. But beneath the headline, the story turns darker. JP Morgan notes that U.S. wholesalers are actively de-risking by cutting inventory orders, anticipating prolonged supply shocks. Walmart and Home Depot have already reported tightening supply margins, with CFOs citing tariff drag. Meanwhile, BLS data shows consumer spending contracted 0.2% in April, the first drop in 5 months, as inventories fell and prices plateaued. While inflation eased to 2.1%, economists warn the slowdown is supply-side driven, not demand-led, which risks stagflation if prolonged. The shelves aren't just thinning. They're warning signs wrapped in shrink wrap. On May 28th, a U.S. federal court in Washington, D.C., ruled that several 2024 tariff escalations lacked proper procedural justification under the Trade Expansion Act, a blow to the Trump administration's strategy of aggressive blanket tariffs. According to the Financial Times, nearly $42 billion in levies on consumer electronics and auto parts are now under judicial review. The administration maintains that all tariffs were national security-based, but critics argue the standards were inconsistently applied. This isn't just a trade issue, it's a constitutional one, said trade law professor Kathleen Clausen of Georgetown. If rulings proceed unfavorably retroactive, reimbursement could exceed $18 billion, impacting Treasury projections. And with Besant calling for a 10% global tariff floor just last week, the policy now risks outpacing its legal foundation. What happens when economic pressure becomes legally unglued? Inflation in April cooled to 2.1%, barely above the Fed's target, and retail spending dipped just 2%, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. On the surface, that signals stability. But Goldman Sachs warns these figures reflect lagged activity, not the impact of tariffs that only took effect weeks earlier. You don't see the shock until it hits margins and layoffs, said John Hatzius, the bank's chief economist. Already, UPS has announced a 12% volume decline in its Asia-US routes, and Target reports a 400 basis point margin drop in Q1, citing import disruption. The real damage isn't in April's numbers. It's what's about to hit in June. So if you're only watching the rearview mirror, you're not going to see the crash coming. On May 29th, the U.S. State Department revoked over 2,000 Chinese student visas under Section 212F, citing strategic espionage concerns. China's foreign ministry blasted the move as a politicized purge, calling it retaliation for its rare earth export controls. Reuters confirmed the visa move came within 48 hours of Washington expanding chip-related export bans to Chinese AI labs. Combined, these decisions mark a shift from economic rivalry to full-spectrum decoupling, affecting not just trade, but talent and research. When both nations begin weaponizing people flows, it's no longer just tariffs, said Bonnie Glaser of the German Marshall Fund. And the irony, some of those students had worked on supply chain optimization, the very disruptions now rippling through U.S. ports. Scott Bessant told Fox News last week that a direct call between President Trump and Chairman Xi will reset the table. But since Trump's May tariff spike, China has declined formal summit invitations, with Politburo analysts warning Beijing expects unpredictability from Washington. Xi Jinping hasn't spoken to Trump since January, and Chinese negotiators have frozen dialogue below vice ministerial level. Meanwhile, the Swiss-brokered Geneva framework, now fraying, was reportedly pushed through without military or tech concessions, a critical omission, according to Bloomberg's Deborah Jian-Lee. Trump insists a call can break the deadlock, but Beijing is waiting for guarantees. And every day they stall, U.S. firms absorb more cost, while China simply withholds minerals without lifting a finger. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, China controls 63% of global rare earth production and 87% of downstream processing capacity. Since April, Beijing has restricted neodymium and dysprosium shipments, key inputs for EVs, and defense systems, triggering a 21% spike in global spot prices. Ford Motor Canard has delayed EV rollouts in Michigan due to supply interruptions, while Germany's BASF warned clients of extended lead times on magnet materials. Despite calls for domestic sourcing, the U.S. still imports 74% of its rare earths from China. And as Xi plays the long game, allies are getting nervous. India's steel ministry is lobbying for independent supply corridors, while the EU Trade Commission issued a rare rebuke to both Washington and Beijing, urging de escalation before commercial resilience erodes beyond repair. Leverage isn't just what you hold, it's what the world notices you're not giving back. So was the Geneva deal breached broken or bait? That depends on which side of the embargo you're standing on. What's clear is that tariffs are rising, talks are stalling, courts are weighing legality, and minerals are quietly vanishing from supply chains. This isn't just friction, it's a fault line. And as Trump calls for new global tariffs, while the legal foundation cracks beneath him, China's leverage isn't in what it says, but in what it withholds. But if you think this was China's boldest play, think again, because there's another move quietly unfolding behind the scenes, one that doesn't involve minerals tariffs or even trade deals. And it could shake the U.S. financial system at its core. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.